March 18th, 1945, 2:15 in the morning. Somewhere in the frozen heart of Western Germany, a lone American soldier crouched behind a rusted farm tractor, his breath crystallizing in the bitter air. Private Jack Mercer had 6 throwing knives strapped across his chest, a Fairbairn-Sykes commando dagger at his hip, and less than 4 hours to do something that command had already declared impossible. 23 Allied prisoners sat in a crude wooden barracks less than 200 meters away. American and British soldiers, airmen, intelligence operatives, men who had been captured behind enemy lines during the chaotic final months of the war. The SS had scheduled their execution at dawn, a firing squad, no trial, no negotiation. 8 guards patrolled the perimeter, 8 armed Germans between Mercer and those condemned men. What made this mission unlike any other was the operational constraint. The compound sat in open farmland, surrounded by flat, treeless terrain for nearly a mile in every direction. Any gunfire would be heard by the Wehrmacht garrison stationed less than 3 kilometers to the east. A single shot meant reinforcements within minutes. It meant the prisoners would be eliminated before rescue could arrive. It meant certain death for everyone. The approach required absolute silence. Not reduced noise, not suppressed weapons, absolute silence. And Jack Mercer, a 22-year-old private from rural Tennessee, was about to deliver exactly that. His commanding officer had selected him for one reason, a skill the Army officially considered obsolete, a skill his fellow soldiers had mocked during training, a skill that would save 23 lives before sunrise. If you appreciate historical stories like this, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. These forgotten tales of extraordinary courage deserve to be remembered, and your support makes that possible. The story of how a farm boy with throwing knives became the centerpiece of an impossible rescue mission begins long before that frozen March night. It begins in the hills of eastern Tennessee, in a childhood spent hunting with tools most soldiers would never consider weapons. Jack Mercer grew up poor, even by Depression-era standards. His father worked a small tobacco farm that barely produced enough to feed the family. Ammunition was expensive, precious, too precious, to waste on rabbits and squirrels when there were other ways to bring home meat. By the time he was 10, young Jack had learned to throw with deadly precision. Not store-bought throwing knives, but homemade blades his grandfather had fashioned from scrap metal. Balance was everything. Weight distribution, the rotation of the wrist, the calculation of distance. He could drop a rabbit at 40 feet before he turned 12. When war came to America in December 1941, Jack Mercer was 18 years old and eager to fight. He enlisted in January 1942, processed through basic training, and shipped overseas with thousands of other young Americans who believed they were going to save the world. What he found in Europe was something far more complicated than the propaganda had suggested. The first time his throwing skill drew attention was during a training exercise in southern England. An instructor was demonstrating knife fighting techniques, explaining the proper methods for close-quarters combat. The curriculum was based largely on the work of William Fairbairn and Eric Sykes, 2 men who had revolutionized how Allied soldiers approached hand-to-hand combat. Fairbairn had spent decades in Shanghai, working for the municipal police, in what was then one of the most dangerous cities on Earth. He had been stabbed, shot, and beaten more times than he could count. He had studied judo with Japanese masters, incorporated Western boxing, and developed something he called gutter fighting. It was brutal, efficient, designed for one purpose: to end confrontations as quickly as possible, by any means necessary. When World War II began, the British recruited Fairbairn and Sykes to train the newly formed commando units. Their methods were revolutionary. They taught soldiers to fight dirty, to target eyes, throats, and groins, to use any weapon at hand, including chairs, bottles, and yes, knives. The Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife became standard issue for British commandos, its slender blade designed specifically for the thrust that would end a fight in one motion. But throwing knives? The military establishment considered that a circus trick, something for showmen and entertainers, not serious soldiers. The physics were unreliable. The variables were too numerous: distance, wind, rotation, target movement. Anyone trained in combat arms understood that a thrown knife sacrificed control. Once that blade left your hand, you were defenseless. A thrown knife that missed meant a soldier without a weapon facing an armed enemy. The instructor in that English training camp made exactly this point. He held up a standard-issue fighting knife and explained that throwing it was not only ineffective, but dangerous to the thrower. He asked if any soldier present was foolish enough to disagree. Jack Mercer raised his hand. What happened next became part of unit legend. The instructor set up a target at the far end of the training ground, roughly 50 feet away. Regulation throwing distance for any demonstration, far enough that most trained knife throwers would consider it challenging. Mercer asked permission to use his personal blade, a weapon he had carried since basic training. A balanced throwing knife with a 7-inch blade, weighted specifically for the rotation he had practiced since childhood. He threw without hesitation. The knife buried itself in the center of the target with a solid thunk that silenced every soldier present. The instructor was not impressed. One throw proved nothing. He demanded Mercer repeat the demonstration, then repeat it again. 6 throws, 6 hits, same target area every time. Then the instructor moved the target to 70 feet. Then 80. Mercer adjusted his stance slightly, compensated for the additional rotation, and continued to hit center mass. This was not, as the instructor had suggested, a circus trick. This was something else entirely. This was a skill refined over years of practice, applied with the precision of a craftsman who understood his tools at a level that transcended conscious thought. But even then, the question remained. What use was a throwing knife in modern warfare? The battlefields of Europe were dominated by artillery, tanks, and automatic weapons. Soldiers fought with rifles and grenades, machine guns and mortars. A knife was a backup weapon, something for emergencies when ammunition ran out. A thrown knife was an even more limited tool, useful only in the rarest of circumstances. Jack Mercer would spend nearly 3 years in Europe before those circumstances finally materialized. The war ground forward. Normandy, the hedgerows of France, the liberation of Paris, the push toward the Rhine. Mercer served with distinction but without particular notice. He was a good soldier, reliable, brave when necessary, cautious when wisdom demanded it. He never had occasion to use his throwing knives in combat. They remained strapped across his chest, hidden beneath his uniform, a personal talisman rather than a practical weapon. By early 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Allied forces pressed from the west, while the Soviet juggernaut rolled from the east. German cities burned, German armies fractured. But the dying beast still had teeth, and in those chaotic final months, desperate men committed desperate acts. The SS had always been the ideological heart of Nazi terror. As defeat became inevitable, some SS units adopted a policy of scorched earth that extended beyond infrastructure to include human beings. Prisoners of war, political detainees, anyone the Reich considered an enemy, became a target for elimination. If Germany was going to fall, these men reasoned, then every enemy within reach should fall with it. This policy created an urgency that had not existed earlier in the war. Intelligence reports filtered back to Allied command describing planned executions, mass graves, the systematic murder of prisoners before liberating forces could arrive. The race to rescue became as important as the race to victory. The prisoners held in that remote farmland compound represented exactly this nightmare scenario. 23 men captured during various operations behind enemy lines over the preceding months. Some were downed airmen, others were members of Special Operations Units, OSS operatives, British commandos. The Germans considered them spies rather than soldiers, and under the infamous Commando Order, issued by Hitler himself in October 1942, captured commandos were to be executed without trial. Intelligence reached Allied command on March 16th that these men were scheduled for execution at dawn on March 18th. The compound was small, isolated, lightly guarded by permanent standards, but sufficiently protected given the open terrain. 8 SS soldiers rotated through guard duty, armed with rifles and submachine guns. A frontal assault was possible, but would certainly result in the deaths of the prisoners. By the time American forces breached the perimeter, the guards would have more than enough time to enter the barracks and eliminate everyone inside. What they needed was something unprecedented: silent entry, silent neutralization of the guards, silent extraction. The officer who conceived this mission was Major Thomas Kerrigan, a veteran of multiple special operations who understood both the limitations and possibilities of unconventional warfare. He had studied the British commando raids, the daring attacks led by men like Anders Lassen, the Danish major who had terrorized German garrisons throughout the Mediterranean and Adriatic. Lassen was a legend among special operators. He had been awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest British military honor, for an action at Lake Comacchio in northern Italy just weeks before Mercer's mission. Lassen had stormed multiple German machine gun positions despite being wounded, enabling his men to complete their objective. He had lost his life in the process, becoming one of only 4 soldiers to receive the Victoria Cross during the entire Italian campaign. But Lassen had worked with teams. He had used grenades, machine pistols, the chaos of coordinated assault. What Kerrigan needed was something quieter, something invisible. He remembered a report about a soldier with unusual skills, a private from Tennessee who could throw a knife with the accuracy of a rifle at distances most experts considered impossible. A soldier who had been demonstrating this ability to increasingly skeptical audiences since 1942, never finding a practical application in the mechanized slaughter of modern warfare. Until now. Kerrigan had Mercer brought to his field headquarters on the evening of March 17th. The major spread a map across his desk and explained the situation without embellishment. 23 prisoners, 8 guards, execution scheduled for dawn. No possibility of conventional assault without triggering the execution. He asked Mercer a simple question. Could he eliminate 8 men without making a sound? The private considered the question for a long moment. He asked about the terrain, the spacing of the guards, their patrol patterns, the distance between positions. Kerrigan provided what intelligence he had, which was frustratingly incomplete. The compound had been observed from a distance, but close reconnaissance was impossible given the flat, open ground. Mercer finally answered. He could try. He made no guarantees. He estimated he would need at least 6 knives, possibly more if retrieval between targets was possible. He would need to study the patrol patterns himself from close enough to understand the timing. He would need darkness and at least some wind to cover minor sounds, and he would need luck. Kerrigan accepted these terms. He provided Mercer with additional intelligence, including rough sketches of the compound layout and estimated guard positions. He offered to send a small support team to wait at the perimeter, ready to intervene if the silent approach failed. Mercer declined the support team. More bodies meant more noise, more variables, more opportunities for something to go wrong. He would go alone or not at all. The major agreed. The insertion began at 2200 hours on March 17, 1945. Mercer approached from the west, using the limited terrain features available for concealment. A dry creek bed that cut across the farmland provided cover for approximately half the distance. Beyond that, he moved slowly across frozen ground, using patches of dead vegetation, abandoned farm equipment, anything that broke the monotony of the open terrain. The temperature had dropped below freezing, unusual for mid-March, but advantageous for the mission. The cold would keep the guards less alert, more focused on staying warm than watching for threats they had no reason to expect. The frozen ground would hold his weight without leaving obvious tracks in mud or soft soil. He reached the outer perimeter of the compound at approximately 0100 hours. From this position, he could observe the guard patterns, timing the rotations, identifying the locations where each man would be at any given moment. The compound was simple. One central barracks where the prisoners were held, surrounded by a low wooden fence that served more as a boundary marker than a defensive obstacle. A small guardhouse near the main entrance, occupied by 2 soldiers at any given time. The remaining 6 guards walked patrol routes around the perimeter, occasionally meeting at predetermined points before separating again. Mercer watched for nearly an hour, mapping the patterns in his mind, calculating distances, identifying the sequence that would give him the best chance of success. The timing was crucial. Each guard needed to be eliminated at a moment when the others would not notice his absence. The patrols needed to continue appearing normal from any distant observation point until all 8 were down. He identified his first target, a guard walking the northern perimeter, passing behind a storage shed that would provide cover for both the approach and the elimination. This guard would reach that position at approximately 02:15. He would be out of sight from the other guards for roughly 30 seconds. Enough time. Mercer moved into position. The cold had settled into his bones, but he forced his hands to remain steady. This was not training. This was not a demonstration. 23 lives depended on what happened in the next few hours. The guard approached on schedule, rifle slung over his shoulder, breath fogging in the cold air. He reached the corner of the storage shed and paused, perhaps to adjust his collar against the wind. He did not hear the soft whisper of movement behind him. The knife flew true. It caught him in the throat before he could make a sound. His hands went to his neck, a reflexive gesture, but no scream emerged, only a wet gurgling that lasted seconds before silence. He collapsed behind the shed, hidden from view. Mercer crossed the distance quickly, retrieved his knife, and pulled the body further into cover. He checked the uniform for anything useful and found keys that might open the barracks door. 1 down, 7 remaining. The second guard patrolled the eastern perimeter. He would not reach a concealed position for another 12 minutes. Mercer waited, his body pressed against the cold ground, invisible in the darkness. The patrol passed without incident. Mercer repositioned. The second throw was more difficult. The distance was greater, roughly 40 feet, and the guard was moving rather than stationary. Mercer calculated the trajectory, the rotation, the intercept point. He released. The blade struck center mass. The guard staggered but did not fall immediately. For a terrifying moment, Mercer thought he might cry out. Instead, the German's legs buckled silently, and he dropped to the frozen earth without alerting his comrades. 2 down, 6 remaining. The third and fourth guards were more challenging. They walked overlapping routes that brought them into visual contact with each other at irregular intervals. Mercer had to wait for the precise moment when one turned away while the other reached a concealed position. The window was perhaps 5 seconds. He moved between them like a shadow. The third guard went down to a thrown blade. The fourth required a closer approach. The Fairbairn-Sykes dagger in hand rather than thrown. A quick strike from behind, soundless, professional. 4 down, 4 remaining. The guardhouse presented the greatest challenge. 2 soldiers stationed inside, relatively warm, relatively alert compared to the frozen sentries walking the perimeter. Mercer studied the structure from a distance, looking for options. A single door, 2 small windows, no clear approach that would allow him to eliminate both before One could raise an alarm. He needed a distraction, something that would draw one guard outside while leaving the other inside, unaware. He considered his options, found one that might work, and began to move. A light tap on the far wall of the guardhouse, soft enough to sound accidental, perhaps falling ice, perhaps a loose board. One of the guards inside responded, stepping out to investigate while his companion remained at the table, warming his hands near a small stove. The guard who stepped outside lasted 3 seconds, a thrown knife from 20 feet catching him in the neck before he could turn toward the sound of movement. He fell against the guardhouse wall, sliding down with barely a whisper. The second guard noticed his companion had not returned. He called out once, a question in German that received no response. He rose from the table, reaching for his rifle, and stepped toward the door. Mercer was waiting. The Fairbairn-Sykes found its mark before the German could process what was happening. He collapsed across the threshold, half inside and half outside the guardhouse, his rifle clattering softly against the wooden floor. 6 down, 2 remaining. The final 2 guards posed the most critical challenge. They had been patrolling in loose coordination, occasionally checking on their companions in the guardhouse or along the perimeter routes. By now, nearly 2 hours had passed since Mercer had begun his silent assault. The guards who should have been reporting were not reporting. The men who should have been visible at certain points were not visible. One of the remaining guards had noticed something was wrong. He moved more cautiously now, rifle unslung and held ready, eyes scanning the darkness with increasing tension. Perhaps he had simply sensed the wrongness in the silence. Perhaps he had spotted something Mercer had missed during his approach. Either way, he was alert, in a way his fallen companions had not been. Mercer had used 5 knives. One remained strapped to his chest, plus the Fairbairn-Sykes at his hip. He considered his options. The alert guard was approaching the barracks, perhaps intending to check on the prisoners or find his companions. The other guard, still unaware of the danger, continued his patrol route along the southern perimeter. Mercer needed to neutralize both within minutes, before either could reach a point where they might raise an alarm. He made a decision. The patrol guard first, using his final throwing knife, then the alert guard using whatever means necessary. He positioned himself along the patrol route, waiting for the soldier to pass. The man appeared on schedule, walking steadily, unaware that death waited in the frozen darkness. The throw was long, nearly 50 feet, at the extreme edge of reliable accuracy. Mercer held his breath, released, and watched the blade spin through the cold air. It struck true. The guard crumpled without a sound, his rifle falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. But retrieving that knife meant exposing himself to the remaining guard, who was now dangerously close to the barracks. There was no time. Mercer moved quickly, circling toward his final target, the Fairbairn-Sykes in hand. The last guard heard something. Perhaps the soft impact of the thrown blade, perhaps the equally soft thud of a body hitting the ground. He turned, bringing his rifle up, searching the darkness for a threat he could feel but not see. Mercer charged. The distance was perhaps 15 feet. The guard had time to fire, but in his panic, the shot went wide. Then Mercer was on him, driving the dagger up under the ribs, one hand clamping over the German's mouth to stifle any cry. They went down together. The German struggled, desperate and dying, but Mercer held him pinned until the movement stopped. Then silence. 8 guards, neutralized, the entire compound silent except for the wind. If you are finding this story compelling, please consider sharing it with others who appreciate military history. Every share helps preserve these remarkable accounts of human courage under impossible circumstances. Mercer lay still for several minutes, listening for any sound that might indicate his approach had been detected. Reinforcements from the garrison, movement from additional guards he had somehow missed. Alarm bells or shouts. Nothing. Only the wind across frozen farmland and the distant rumble of artillery somewhere to the east. He rose and moved toward the barracks. The keys he had taken from the first guard fit the lock. He opened the door slowly, carefully, unsure what he would find inside. 23 faces stared at him from the darkness. American and British soldiers, emaciated from weeks or months of captivity, some injured, all exhausted. They had been awake, waiting for dawn and the execution that had been promised. They had expected to die within hours. Instead, they found a single American private standing in the doorway, covered in frozen mud and blood, asking if they could walk. Several could not. Severe malnutrition, multiple contusions, possible internal injuries from beatings during interrogation. These men would need to be carried or supported, slowing the extraction significantly. Mercer assessed the situation quickly and made decisions without hesitation. 3 of the strongest prisoners would help carry the wounded. The rest would move as quickly as possible toward the rally point, where evacuation transport would be waiting. They had perhaps 90 minutes before dawn, before the execution detail would arrive and discover what had happened. The extraction proved almost as challenging as the infiltration. Moving 23 men, many in poor physical condition, across open terrain in darkness required coordination and luck. They followed the same dry creek bed Mercer had used during his approach, moving single file, the wounded supported between stronger companions. At one point, a German patrol passed within 200 meters of their position. Everyone froze, pressing themselves into the frozen mud of the creek bed, holding their breath, while flashlights swept the distant field. The patrol moved on without discovering them. They reached the evacuation point at 0530, just as the first gray light of dawn was beginning to appear on the eastern horizon. American trucks waited, engines running, medics prepared to receive casualties. Mercer helped load the final prisoner and then collapsed against the tailgate, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. The British lieutenant who had been senior among the prisoners found him there. He gripped Mercer's hand and spoke quietly, words that would later appear in official reports and commendations. He dropped those guards like they were not even there. Silent, efficient, professional. I have never seen anything like it. The return to American lines was uneventful. By the time German forces discovered the empty compound and the 8 dead guards, the prisoners were already receiving medical attention at a field hospital. Several required extended hospitalization. All survived. The official record of that night remains fragmentary. Special operations in the closing months of World War II were often poorly documented, overshadowed by the massive conventional operations that dominated the headlines. The liberation of major POW camps like Stalag 7A in Moosburg, Bavaria, or Stalag 9B in Bad Orb received attention because of their scale. Single compounds holding small numbers of prisoners were footnotes, if they were noted at all. But among those who knew, the story of what Jack Mercer accomplished became something more than a footnote. It became evidence of what was possible when skill, courage, and circumstances aligned in ways that defied conventional military wisdom. The throwing knife had been dismissed as obsolete, a showman's trick, a relic of frontier mythology with no place in modern warfare. Yet in those frozen hours, it had proved to be exactly what the mission required. Silent, precise, deadly. A weapon perfectly suited to a situation that no one had anticipated and few could have survived. This was not, it should be noted, the only remarkable knife throw of the Second World War. George Skeeter Vaughan, a Cherokee-American soldier known by his native name Gray Otter, had accomplished something equally extraordinary during combat operations in the European theater. Vaughan was a Hollywood stuntman before the war, famous for his knife and tomahawk throwing demonstrations at shows throughout California. When war came, he brought those skills into combat. During one operation, he faced a German sentry who needed to be eliminated silently. The distance was 87 feet downhill with a modified bayonet as his only weapon. He calculated the trajectory, factoring in the slope, the rotation, the point where the blade would need to intercept the target. He drew bead on a spot approximately 3 feet above the sentry's head and released. The bayonet rotated end over end through the air and struck the German at the base of the skull, eliminating him instantly. Vaughan later attributed the accuracy to luck and prayer as much as skill. The variables involved in such a throw were enormous. Wind, distance, target movement, the specific weight and balance of the weapon. Any miscalculation would have meant missing the target entirely, or worse, alerting the enemy to his presence. But luck favors the prepared, as the saying goes. Vaughan had thrown knives and tomahawks since childhood, exactly like Mercer. He had developed an intuitive understanding of the physics involved that transcended conscious calculation. When the moment came, his body knew what to do, even if his mind could not fully explain it. These stories raise interesting questions about the nature of military training and the value of unconventional skills. The official military establishment had dismissed knife throwing as impractical, and in most circumstances, that assessment was correct. Modern battlefields offered few opportunities for silent elimination of enemies at range. Firearms, explosives, and coordinated maneuver had replaced individual combat skills as the primary determinants of military success. But war is not most circumstances. War is an endless series of exceptions, unexpected situations that demand improvised solutions. The soldier who possesses skills beyond the standard curriculum may find those skills useless for years, only to discover a single moment when they become essential. William Fairbairn understood this principle. His entire approach to combat training was built on the recognition that real fights rarely followed predictable patterns. He taught his students to use anything at hand as a weapon, to adapt to circumstances rather than rely on predetermined tactics. His famous instruction to OSS and commando trainees emphasized one core principle: kill or be killed. The Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife itself was a product of this philosophy. It was not designed for knife fighting in the dueling sense, not created for extended combat between two skilled opponents. It was designed for silent elimination, one thrust, one kill. Move on to the next target. The knife was a tool of assassination rather than warfare, meant for the specialized circumstances where gunfire was impossible and close quarters contact was unavoidable. Rex Applegate, the American colonel who adapted Fairbairn's methods for OSS operatives, expanded on these concepts throughout the war. He trained intelligence officers and commandos in what he called ungentlemanly fighting, techniques that included targeting vulnerable areas like eyes and groins, using improvised weapons, and employing deception and surprise to overcome armed opponents. These methods represented a different kind of warfare than the mass mobilization and industrial production that characterized most of World War II. They recognized that small numbers of highly skilled individuals operating behind enemy lines could accomplish objectives that entire battalions might fail to achieve through conventional means. Anders Lassen embodied this approach better than perhaps any other soldier of the war. The Danish major, who had joined British forces after his country fell to German occupation, became one of the most feared and respected special operators in the European theater. His exploits with the small-scale raiding force and later the Special Boat Squadron became legend among both Allied and Axis forces. Lassen was not primarily a knife fighter, though he carried his commando dagger everywhere and was known to use it when necessary. His style was aggressive, direct, willing to accept personal risk in exchange for speed and violence of action. He once stormed a German position alone, eliminating the defenders with hand grenades and his bare hands when his weapon jammed. The commando order that Hitler issued in October 1942 was, in part, a response to operations led by Lassen and soldiers like him. The order declared that all captured commandos were to be executed without trial, regardless of whether they wore uniforms or attempted to surrender. It was a war crime, a direct violation of international law, but it reflected the genuine terror that Allied Special Operations Forces had inspired in German High Command. The prisoners Mercer rescued were held under the provisions of that order. They had been captured during special operations, classified as terrorists rather than soldiers, and condemned to die without the protections afforded to regular prisoners of war. The SS guards assigned to their compound were not ordinary soldiers. They were men who believed they were carrying out a legitimate order to eliminate enemies of the Reich. In this context, Mercer's achievement takes on additional significance. He was not simply rescuing prisoners, he was undoing the consequences of a policy designed to terrorize Allied special forces into inaction. Every prisoner he saved represented a failure of that policy, proof that the Reich could not simply murder its way to security. The closing months of the war saw numerous rescue operations throughout the European theater as Allied forces raced to liberate POW camps before the Germans could carry out mass executions. Some of these operations became famous. Task Force Baum, the controversial raid ordered by General Patton to reach Oflag 13B near Hammelburg, captured public attention due to the personal connection. Patton's son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, was imprisoned there. That raid failed in its immediate objective, suffering heavy casualties without successfully extracting the prisoners. The camp was eventually liberated by conventional forces 10 days later, and Waters survived. But the failure illustrated the difficulty of penetrating deep behind enemy lines to rescue specific prisoners, even with armored support and significant resources. Other operations succeeded against longer odds. The liberation of Stalag 9B at Bad Orb involved Task Force federally driving 37 miles through enemy-held territory to reach a camp holding thousands of American prisoners. The conditions there were horrific. American soldiers, particularly Jewish service members, had been subjected to forced labor and deliberate mistreatment. The rescue arrived just in time to prevent further atrocities. Operation Revival extracted nearly 8,500 Allied prisoners from Stalag Luft 1 using stripped-down B-17 bombers and transport aircraft. The scale of that operation dwarfed anything Mercer accomplished with his throwing knives, moving prisoners by the thousands rather than the dozens. But scale is not everything. Each life saved represents a family reunited, a story continued, a future preserved. The 23 men Mercer brought out of that frozen compound returned to lives that might otherwise have ended before a firing squad on a cold March morning. Some went on to have children and grandchildren who would never have existed without that night's work. This is, perhaps, the ultimate lesson of stories like Mercer's. War is measured in grand strategic terms, in battles won and territories captured, in the rise and fall of nations. But it is experienced in individual moments, by individual people making individual decisions that accumulate into historical outcomes. A young man growing up in Tennessee, learning to throw knives because ammunition was too expensive, a military establishment that dismissed his skill as useless, years of service without opportunity to apply what he knew. And then, finally, a single night when everything aligned. The skill, the need, the courage to act. Those alignments are rare. Most soldiers serve their entire careers without encountering circumstances that call for unusual abilities. But when such moments arise, they reveal something important about human potential, the capacity for excellence in domains that seem irrelevant until suddenly they are not. Fairbairn understood this. Applegate understood this. The special operations community that emerged from World War II understood this. Training should be broad rather than narrow, encompassing skills that might never be needed alongside skills that certainly will be. The soldier who can do one thing is vulnerable to circumstances that require something else. The soldier who can do many things has options when conventional approaches fail. Jack Mercer returned from the war without fanfare. He was decorated quietly, his achievement noted in classified reports that would not become public for decades. He went back to Tennessee, married his childhood sweetheart, and lived a life that rarely touched on what he had done during the war. When asked about his service, he typically changed the subject. But those who knew what happened on that frozen night remembered. The British lieutenant who had been senior among the prisoners corresponded with Mercer for years afterward, exchanging letters that acknowledged a debt that could never be fully repaid. Other survivors did the same, reaching out on anniversaries and holidays to remind a quiet farmer that he had given them back their lives. The throwing knives went into a display case in Mercer's home. Occasionally, visitors would ask about them, and he would demonstrate his skill on a target set up behind the barn. Even in his 60s, he could hit center mass at 40 feet. The muscle memory never faded, even if the reflexes slowed and the joints stiffened. He died in 1992, surrounded by family, having lived nearly 50 years beyond that night, when everything depended on what his hands could do. His obituary mentioned his wartime service in general terms, but gave no details. Only a handful of people at his funeral knew the full story. Thank you for watching this account of one of World War II's most remarkable rescue missions. If you found this story valuable, please subscribe to the channel and share it with others who appreciate military history. The comment section below is open for your thoughts, questions, and any additional information you might have about similar operations during the war. Every engagement helps preserve these stories for future generations who deserve to know what ordinary people accomplished under extraordinary circumstances. The lessons of that frozen March night extend beyond military history. They speak to human potential, to the value of unconventional preparation, to the moments when skills dismissed as useless suddenly become essential. Jack Mercer was mocked for his throwing knives until the moment they saved 23 lives. In that inversion lies a truth worth remembering. We rarely know in advance which abilities will prove decisive. Train broadly. Practice what others dismiss. Be ready for the situation no one expects, because somewhere, someday, there may be a barracks full of condemned men, a perimeter of armed guards, and a deadline measured in hours. And in that moment, the skill everyone laughed at might be the only thing between life and death.